In the summer of 1943, the fields of Volhynia glowed under golden sunlight. But that beauty was an illusion. Beneath the calm of villages and churches, death was approaching. Neighbors who once shared markets and festivals would soon turn on each other with knives, axes, and fire. It was not an army invading, but an uprising of hatred. The Ukrainian Insurgent Army launched a campaign to erase the Polish presence forever, and the victims were not soldiers but civilians, mothers, children, the elderly. Churches became tombs, homes became pyres, and by the end, more than 100,000 Poles were slaughtered in one of the most forgotten genocides of World War II. This is not just a tale of war, but of betrayal, of vengeance, and of neighbors becoming executioners. This is the dark story of Volhynia, 1943. Part 1. Seeds of Hatred. The summer sun of 1943 bathed the rolling fields of Volhynia in golden light. But beneath that beauty lurked a storm of violence and hate. It was a land of villages and farms, where Poles and Ukrainians had lived side by side for centuries, sometimes as neighbors, sometimes as rivals, and too often as enemies. What was about to happen in Volhynia would scar history forever. One of the most brutal campaigns of ethnic cleansing in modern Europe, where over 100,000 Polish civilians, men, women, and children, would be slaughtered in their homes, their churches, and their villages. Yet the massacre did not emerge from nowhere. It was born of deep wounds, old grievances, and the deadly fuel of nationalism. To understand the horror of Volhynia, 1943, we must first journey back into the seeds of hatred that were sown long before the blood began to flow. Volhynia, a fertile region in the borderlands of Eastern Europe, had always been a crossroads of nations and empires. Once part of the medieval Kievan Rus, later absorbed into the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and eventually folded into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It was a land contested by many. By the 20th century, it had become a patchwork of ethnic groups: Poles, Ukrainians, Jews, and smaller minorities like Czechs and Armenians. These groups often lived in close proximity but under unequal terms. Poles, tied to the old nobility and landowning classes, frequently held positions of privilege, while the Ukrainian peasantry bore the brunt of poverty and marginalization. The tension between them simmered for centuries, occasionally erupting in uprisings such as the bloody Cossack revolts of the 17th century, where Polish landlords and Catholic priests were slaughtered by Ukrainian rebels seeking freedom from domination. The collapse of empires after World War I reshaped Eastern Europe, but it did not resolve these old tensions. When the Austro-Hungarian and Russian empires crumbled, both Poles and Ukrainians saw an opportunity for nationhood. Poland re-emerged as an independent state in 1918, while Ukrainians sought to create their own republics. Yet their ambitions collided violently. The Polish-Ukrainian War of 1918 to 1919 over Eastern Galicia and Volhynia ended with Polish victory and the incorporation of these lands into the Second Polish Republic. For Ukrainians, this was not liberation but conquest. They dreamed of independence, but instead they found themselves subjects of a Polish state that treated them with suspicion and hostility. In the interwar years, Volhynia became a pressure cooker. The Polish government pursued policies of Polonization, attempting to assimilate Ukrainians into Polish culture, language, and Catholicism. Orthodox churches were demolished or converted into Roman Catholic churches. Ukrainian schools were restricted. Polish settlers were encouraged to colonize Ukrainian lands, deepening resentment among the peasantry. For many Ukrainians, these policies were not just insults but direct attacks on their identity and dignity. The memory of lost independence and the reality of discrimination nourished a growing nationalist movement. That movement was embodied in the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, founded in 1929. Inspired by radical right-wing ideologies spreading across Europe, the AUN preached that Ukraine could only achieve freedom through struggle, violence, and ethnic purity. Their vision of a Ukrainian nation left little room for Poles, Jews, or Russians. The OUN split into factions, but its most militant wing, led by Stepan Bandera, embraced terror as a weapon. They assassinated Polish officials, attacked symbols of Polish rule, and vowed to expel all enemies of Ukraine from Ukrainian lands. Though small in number before the war, they planted the ideological seeds for what was to come. Then came September 1939. The world descended into war when Nazi Germany invaded Poland from the west, and just over 2 weeks later, the Soviet Union invaded from the east under the secret terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Poland was crushed, its state destroyed. Volhynia, with its large Ukrainian population, fell under Soviet occupation. For many Ukrainians, Soviet rule was a mixed experience. The Soviets suppressed nationalist organizations like the OUN, but they also weakened Polish landowners and Catholic institutions. Polish elites were deported to Siberia, imprisoned, or executed, while Ukrainian peasants sometimes welcomed the decline of Polish dominance. Yet Soviet rule was brutal for all. Collectivization, repression, and political terror created fear and suffering. The ground was fertile for violence and for nationalist dreams that promised liberation through blood. In June 1941, Nazi Germany betrayed its Soviet ally and invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa. The Wehrmacht swept into Ukraine and Volhynia, greeted at first by some Ukrainians as liberators from Stalin's terror. But the Nazis had no intention of granting Ukraine independence. Instead, they ruled with ruthless exploitation, seizing food, conscripting labor, and targeting Jews for extermination. Volhynia's Jewish population, once a vibrant community of towns and villages, was systematically annihilated in the Holocaust. Tens of thousands of Jews were shot in pits or deported to death camps. This genocide unfolded in parallel with the rising tide of violence between Poles and Ukrainians, each group pulled into the orbit of greater powers, yet also fighting its own local war. The chaos of Nazi occupation gave the OUN and its military wing, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army (UPA), their opportunity. Initially, some Ukrainian nationalists cooperated with the Germans, seeing them as useful allies against the Soviets. But by 1942, realizing that Nazi Germany would not allow Ukrainian independence, the UPA turned its struggle toward building a state by its own hands. Their vision was clear and chilling: an ethnically pure Ukrainian land. To achieve this, the Poles, seen as colonizers and enemies of the nation, had to be removed. And removal, in the brutal logic of wartime nationalism, meant massacre. Polish underground forces, too, were active in the army, a Krajowa Home Army, loyal to the Polish government in exile in London, sought to preserve Polish claims to the Eastern Territories. This created a collision course: two underground armies, both claiming the same land, both dreaming of a post-war order where the other had no place. As 1943 began, the stage was set for mass bloodshed. Distrust had hardened into hatred, and hatred into plans of extermination. The UPA began preparing to launch a systematic campaign to wipe Poles from Volhynia. In February 1943, the first coordinated massacres began. Polish villages were attacked, their inhabitants slaughtered with rifles, axes, knives, and fire. Survivors recalled horrific scenes: families hacked to death, churches burned with people inside, children impaled on pitchforks. It was not random violence, but an organized campaign. Orders circulated among UPA units to cleanse Volhynia of Poles, to kill all men, women, and children, so that no Polish community would remain. By spring, the massacre spread across the countryside. For the Poles of Volhynia, the nightmare had begun. But in truth, the roots of this horror had been planted long before, in centuries of conflict, oppression, and the poisonous allure of nationalism. Volhynia was not simply a battlefield of two armies, but a killing ground of civilians, where neighbors turned on neighbors, and the dream of national purity demanded the sacrifice of the innocent. The seeds of hatred had blossomed into a harvest of blood, and the summer of 1943 would be its deadliest season. Part 2. The Summer of Blood. By the time the summer of 1943 arrived, Volhynia had become a landscape of fear and suspicion. The air itself seemed thick with tension. Villagers whispered of raids in nearby settlements. Farmers abandoned their fields at night, afraid to sleep under the open sky. Children huddled close to their mothers, sensing danger they could not yet name. The Ukrainian Insurgent Army (UPA), organized and well-trained in guerrilla tactics, moved with purpose through the forests and roads, targeting Polish settlements systematically. Unlike the chaos of battlefields elsewhere in Europe, this campaign was methodical, precise, and merciless. Each village attacked, each home burned, each life extinguished served a grim objective: to erase the Polish presence from Volhynia forever. The first major wave of attacks began in February 1943, but the violence reached its horrific crescendo in July, a period that became known to survivors as the Summer of Blood. On July 11, 1943, the UPA launched what would later be remembered as Bloody Sunday. Across Volhynia, coordinated assaults struck dozens of Polish villages simultaneously. Families were woken in the dead of night by the cries of insurgents breaking doors and shattering windows. Those who fled were hunted through the forests. Priests, teachers, and anyone connected to Polish administration were often the first victims, executed publicly to terrorize the rest. Survivors recounted entire villages disappearing in hours, leaving nothing but smoldering ruins and the smell of burning wood mixed with human flesh. The methods of killing were brutal and intimate. Unlike distant artillery bombardments, this was face-to-face violence. Axes, knives, and improvised weapons were common. Some victims were thrown into burning barns, others hacked to death in their own homes. Children were not spared. Accounts described mothers being cut down while clutching infants, teenagers executed for daring to hide, and elderly villagers beaten and left for dead. In the chaos, many tried to flee into the surrounding forests, only to encounter patrols of insurgents lying in wait, cutting off escape routes and driving survivors back toward slaughter. The scale and intensity of violence sent shockwaves through the region, spreading terror even to villages yet untouched. By midsummer, entire districts were emptied of their Polish population. Farmers who once tilled the soil saw their homes burned. Fields lay untended, livestock slaughtered, and crops destroyed. Survivors who managed to escape did so on foot, often through miles of dense forest, carrying children, elderly relatives, and the remnants of what few belongings they could salvage. Refugee columns moved cautiously, haunted by the screams of neighbors they left behind and aware that no safe haven awaited them. The summer of 1943 transformed Volhynia from a fertile, lived-in region into a theater of death, with abandoned villages echoing with silence punctuated only by the occasional distant gunfire or the crackle of fire. The UPA's campaign was not random but meticulously organized. Orders circulated through insurgent units, instructing them to strike every Polish settlement, to kill men first, then women and children, and to burn homes and churches. Villagers reported seeing columns of insurgents moving in formation, armed with rifles, grenades, and axes, sometimes signaling with whistles and coordinated shouts. Survivors later described the horror of watching their neighbors slaughtered and realizing that no help would come. The German occupiers were indifferent, focused on their own war efforts, and the Soviets were across the front lines, inaccessible. The massacre unfolded in a terrifying vacuum where law, order, and humanity had all but disappeared. One of the most infamous episodes involved the village of Porek, where the UPA arrived before dawn. Survivors recalled the sound of shouting, screaming, and the tearing apart of wooden doors. Families tried to barricade themselves inside homes, but the insurgents broke through, dragging men into the streets to be executed. Women and children were thrown into burning barns. No one was spared. By the end of the day, every house had been burned, and only a handful of survivors remained to recount the atrocity. Such scenes were repeated across dozens of villages. The violence, not only physical, but but psychological, leaving survivors scarred for life. The psychological terror extended beyond immediate killings. Villagers lived in constant fear of betrayal. Even neighbors could not be trusted. In some cases, Ukrainians sympathetic to the insurgents were forced to cooperate in identifying Polish households or guiding attackers to hidden families. Poles hiding in attics, cellars or forests had to remain perfectly silent, aware that the slightest noise could mean death for themselves and those sheltering with them. The fear was compounded by the summer's heat and the lack of food or clean water, which made hiding even more perilous. The forest, which might have offered refuge, became a labyrinth of danger, with insurgent patrols and hostile locals threatening every step. The UPA's campaign was driven by ideology as much as strategy. Ukrainian nationalists viewed the Polish population as an obstacle to the creation of an ethnically homogeneous Ukrainian state. Local grievances, historical tensions, and interwar discrimination fueled hatred that the insurgents channeled into systematic slaughter. Documents recovered after the war revealed chilling instructions for cleansing operations. No Polish survivor was to remain in villages, and all infrastructure supporting Polish life, schools, churches, community centers, was to be destroyed. The killings were both punishment and preemptive measures. The insurgents feared that Polish underground forces could return after the war, so eradicating the population entirely was seen as the only solution. As summer turned to autumn, news of the massacres spread throughout Volhynia and into neighboring regions. Polish underground forces, including the army at Craiova, attempted to respond, but their efforts were limited and often localized. Retaliatory strikes were small compared to the scale of the UPA campaign, and civilians remained overwhelmingly the primary victims. Refugee flows increased, with thousands moving toward areas perceived as safer, such as German-controlled cities or the Soviet front lines. Yet safety was never guaranteed, and the trauma of witnessing neighbors and family members killed left deep psychological scars on survivors. The Summer of Blood also marked the destruction of cultural heritage. Churches, schools, and civic buildings were intentionally burned, along with personal libraries, letters, and family documents. This destruction was both symbolic and practical. It eradicated traces of Polish life and identity from Volhynia. Villages that had existed for centuries disappeared overnight, replaced by ash, rubble, and silence. Cemeteries were desecrated, crosses toppled, and monuments defaced. Survivors returned months or years later to find nothing remaining but the outlines of foundations and the lingering stench of fire. The violence was total, designed to obliterate not just people, but the memory of a people. Some communities managed to mount brief defenses. In a handful of villages, Polish residents armed themselves with farm tools, hunting rifles, or weapons recovered from German forces. They constructed barricades and attempted to resist the insurgents. These skirmishes sometimes delayed the killings and occasionally allowed a few more civilians to escape. But they were exceptions in a campaign defined by overwhelming violence. The UPA, motivated by ideology and trained in guerrilla tactics, could strike swiftly and retreat into forests, leaving destruction behind. For most Poles, survival depended on luck, silence, and the mercy of chance. By the end of 1943, the scale of the tragedy was apparent. Tens of thousands of Polish civilians had perished. Entire regions of Volhynia were depopulated or emptied of their Polish communities. Villages that had thrived for centuries were reduced to ashes. Those who survived carried with them memories of horror so vivid that they would never speak of it lightly. The Summer of Blood had transformed Volhynia forever. It was no longer a patchwork of communities, but a land haunted by smoke, fire, and the cries of the dead. Yet even as the massacres continued, the cycle of revenge began to take shape. Polish underground units, alongside local militias, started organizing retaliatory attacks against Ukrainian villages suspected of harboring insurgents. The hatred and brutality that had been unleashed on Polish civilians now began to sweep back against Ukrainian communities. The lines between victim and perpetrator blurred as revenge and ideology drove both sides toward ever more horrifying violence. What had started as a nationalist campaign to cleanse land and people was spiraling into a mutual catastrophe that threatened to engulf the entire region. The Summer of Blood was a turning point in Volhynia's history. It exposed the deadly consequences of nationalism, the ease with which neighbors could become executioners, and the vulnerability of civilians caught between armies and ideologies. It was a warning of what happens when hatred goes unchecked, and political goals justify mass murder. By the end of 1943, Volhynia was no longer a land of villages and farms, but a graveyard, a landscape of terror, and a reminder of humanity's capacity for cruelty. Part 3. Revenge and Ruins. By the autumn of 1943, Volhynia was unrecognizable. The land had become a theater of death, scarred by smoke, fire, and blood. Polish survivors, who had fled into forests or hidden in basements, began to hear stories of families slaughtered, villages burned, and neighbors executed. Shock and grief slowly hardened into anger. The Armia Krajowa, the Polish Home Army, along with local militias, began organizing retaliatory operations. What had started as a campaign of ethnic cleansing by the Ukrainian Insurgent Army (UPA) now spiraled into a cycle of vengeance. Polish forces, though fewer in number and less organized than the UPA, targeted Ukrainian villages suspected of aiding insurgents. The violence was immediate, personal, and merciless. The Polish retaliatory attacks often mirrored the tactics of the UPA. Villages were surrounded, insurgents hunted down, and civilians who could be connected to the insurgents were executed. Churches and homes that had provided shelter to Ukrainians were burned. Sometimes the reprisals were indiscriminate. Entire communities suffered for the actions of a few. Survivors later described these retaliatory strikes as terrifying. Ukrainians, who had once lived peacefully alongside Polish neighbors, now faced the wrath of the very people they had sought to expel. The revenge campaigns were fueled not only by survival instincts, but by grief and anger. Polish fighters carried with them memories of massacres they had witnessed or heard about. Mothers and children killed, neighbors slaughtered. Each atrocity became a motivator for the next. Villages that had escaped initial attacks became targets if they were suspected of sheltering insurgents or assisting in prior massacres. Some historians estimate that tens of thousands of Ukrainians perished in these retaliatory attacks, though numbers are difficult to verify. The line between justice and revenge blurred, and for civilians on both sides, there was no escape. Meanwhile, the UPA did not relent. The insurgents continued to carry out operations against Poles, forcing the Home Army and local militias to escalate their defenses. The forested terrain of Volhynia allowed guerrilla fighters to strike swiftly and vanish into the trees, leaving behind terror and destruction. Polish villages that had survived initial massacres remained on edge, building barricades, digging foxholes, and arming themselves as best they could. Many Poles fled to German-controlled areas, hoping for safety, only to encounter occupation forces indifferent to their plight or, at times, hostile. The mutual violence destroyed the social fabric of Volhynia. Neighboring communities, once intertwined by trade, family ties, and shared culture, were now divided by suspicion and fear. Some Ukrainian families fled westward to avoid Polish retaliation, while others hid among sympathetic neighbors. Polish refugees spread east and south, hoping to reach safer territories. The forests, rivers, and roads became lifelines for those fleeing, but also hunting grounds for armed bands. The countryside, once peaceful, was transformed into a dangerous maze where survival depended on luck, knowledge of the terrain, and the mercy of strangers. The summer and autumn of 1943 also marked the destruction of what little infrastructure had remained after the initial massacres. Villages were burned, churches destroyed, schools and town halls looted or demolished, crops and livestock were seized or slaughtered. The economic devastation left survivors with little means to rebuild. Even as the front lines of World War II shifted, the violence in Volhynia continued unabated, creating layers of trauma and loss. Entire generations were marked by the horror they witnessed. Children who survived were forced to grow up in forests, hiding from attackers, or as refugees wandering the countryside. Families were torn apart. Some were reunited years later, others never. The Polish retaliatory attacks, though smaller in scale compared to the UPA massacres, contributed to a mutual spiral of violence. Each side used brutality to punish and deter the other, creating an environment where no civilians were safe. Reports from the time describe villages reduced to ashes, bodies burned or buried in mass graves, and survivors living in constant terror. The violence was cyclical. UPA attacks prompted Polish reprisals, which in turn provoked further UPA assaults. The cycle created an atmosphere of perpetual fear, where no village could be considered secure for long. The human toll of the Volhynia massacres and revenge campaigns was staggering. Over 100,000 Polish civilians were killed, along with tens of thousands of Ukrainians in retaliatory attacks. Families vanished, histories were erased, and the cultural landscape of Volhynia was irreversibly altered. Survivors carried the trauma for decades, recounting horror stories in whispers, often unwilling or unable to share the full extent of what they had seen. Even today, the memory of Volhynia remains contentious, with debates over the scale of violence, responsibility, and the proper way to remember the victims. Amid the carnage, acts of humanity and courage occasionally emerged. Some Ukrainians hid Poles from UPA forces, risking their lives to save others. Some Polish civilians protected Ukrainians from reprisals, recognizing that revenge only perpetuated suffering. Yet these stories were rare, overshadowed by the overwhelming scale of violence and the systemic nature of the massacres. The war had stripped away much of the social cohesion that had once existed in Volhynia. Communities were fractured, trust destroyed, and neighborly bonds severed. By 1944, the tide of World War II had shifted. Soviet forces advanced westward, driving the Germans from Ukraine. The arrival of the Red Army marked the end of the UPA's large-scale operations in Volhynia. Though pockets of resistance persisted, Polish and Ukrainian survivors faced the daunting task of rebuilding their lives amid rubble, fear, and lingering animosity. Many Poles were relocated westward as borders shifted after the war, while Ukrainians faced displacement or persecution. The massacres and retaliatory violence had fundamentally changed Volhynia, leaving it depopulated, scarred, and haunted by the memories of mass murder. The legacy of the Volhynia massacres extends beyond statistics. It is a story of what can happen when nationalism, hatred, and war converge to target civilians. It is a story of how ordinary people can become victims, and how grief and anger can transform into cycles of vengeance. Entire communities were erased, and the psychological trauma endured by survivors would echo for generations. Families who had once lived peacefully together were now divided by the bloodshed. Villages were left empty, and fields once fertile lay fallow. The memory of Volhynia is a testament to the human cost of ethnic hatred and the fragility of social cohesion during times of conflict. Historians continue to study Volhynia, seeking to document and understand the full extent of the massacres. Monuments and memorials now mark some of the sites of mass graves, honoring the victims and reminding the world of the horrors that occurred. Polish and Ukrainian historians debate terminology, responsibility, and context, but the facts remain. Tens of thousands of lives were destroyed in the summer and autumn of 1943, leaving scars that cannot be undone. The region's landscape of death, once a place of daily life and community, remains a somber reminder of the consequences of unchecked hatred. Volhynia's story is not just a historical event, it is a warning. The massacres and retaliatory violence reveal how political ideologies and nationalist fervor can escalate into systematic killing. They show how civilians, caught in the crossfire, become targets in wars they did not choose, and they demonstrate the long-lasting psychological and cultural damage that such atrocities inflict. For those who survived, the memories were indelible. For those who did not, their absence speaks through the silence of burned villages and empty fields. The ruins of Volhynia serve as both memorial and cautionary tale. Families were shattered, communities destroyed, and generations marked by trauma. The events of 1943 remain one of the most harrowing examples of ethnic violence during World War II. By understanding the massacres and the revenge campaigns, we confront the dark capacity of human societies to turn neighbor against neighbor, and we acknowledge the cost of hatred left unchecked. Volhynia's forests, villages, and fields will never forget the cries that once echoed through them, the cries of children, mothers, fathers, and elders who perished in the summer of blood. Even decades later, Volhynia's story resonates as a reminder of the fragility of peace and the consequences of vengeance. The massacres and retaliations left an imprint not only on the land, but on the collective memory of both Polish and Ukrainian peoples. They remain a painful lesson in the dangers of nationalism, ideological extremism, and the human capacity for cruelty. And as history continues to examine these events, the victims demand to be remembered, their lives and deaths a warning to future generations. Hatred begets violence, violence begets revenge, and the ruins of revenge can last far longer than the battles themselves. Until next time, stay safe, and see you in the next history.